This is Ken Scott on behalf of Fortis Publishing in association with Gutenberg Press. And as you can see from the screen there, we have the book on the back wall there, that way, because it didn't stop when it ended, by Patricia Wennell, who we have. You're not in England, are you, Tricia? You're in Spain.
I am.
You're on a little holiday, I believe, with your husband.
Yeah, a few days away.
Good stuff, good stuff. You're not that far from me, if I remember right. But anyway, we're not here to talk about holidays or Spain or anything like that, or your husband, indeed your husband. We're here to talk about your book, which I believe was published, was it last month or the month before?
Yes, September, yeah.
Okay, September. And I've read your book. Let's say it was very different to anything I've ever read before. I wouldn't normally read that type of book, but when I did get into it, that's not to say I didn't get into it straight away. I didn't mean to say that. But when I started to read it, it's the sort of book that it isn't an easy read, but it then becomes very difficult to put down, because we want to know where your journey ends up, I suppose. So why don't you tell people a little bit about your journey and why you decided to pull this book together?
Okay, well, I'd kept a journal for a few times in my life, but I'd started to keep a journal when I began the therapy relationship with Hilary, because when I'd used a journal before, I knew that it really helped me sort out my feelings and gave me a place to kind of take some of the pain of the things that were unfolding in the sessions, and to kind of try and work out what it meant to me and how I felt.
Before we get to that stage, am I right? Well, I do know, but you had rather a troubled childhood, yes, correct? Now, I don't want you to go into explicits or anything like that. Can you just tell the people listening to this on YouTube or the podcast just a little bit about it?
Yeah, so my childhood began very well in a family where there was lots of love and laughter. But by the time I got to kind of 6 or 7, things started to go very wrong. And it was around a time when my mum began to experience some mental health problems. Back then, in the early 60s, there wasn't really a kind of understanding and awareness of mental health. And Mum started to struggle just with everyday things, and she became very angry and violent towards us all. That kind of then moved into her having a breakdown, it was termed back then. And then when she came back home, she wasn't a lot better. And within a few years of that first breakdown, she became even more ill and was a lot worse. And it was not easy being her child. Mum just didn't cope with everyday life. She didn't cope with all the challenges that came with 4 young children. And it was a very painful and difficult time. The vulnerability that came out of having a mum like that resulted in as children, in us being left unsupervised a lot of the time. And on one of those occasions, myself and some other vulnerable children in the area were noticed by a man who befriended our family, offered to take me out and spend time with me and reduce the pressure on my parents. And unfortunately, he was a paedophile. And after some time of grooming, which is a term used for when somebody creates a situation of trust between themselves and a child, and then he sexually abused me. Okay. And I carried that for my whole life into my adult years.
And your book is your journey into therapy, really, isn't it?
Yeah, so it's tales of my experience with a therapist who who I didn't actually meet until I was in my 40s. So I was living with back pain and hurt for a long time. And then I met Hilary and we worked together for several years. And that's when I kept the journal and wrote my feelings, wrote poetry, and I used it as a means of an outlet. It was a way of me being able to express myself in a safe environment in between my sessions with her. And I found it incredibly helpful. It was a huge volume by the end of my therapy with Hilary. And the opportunity arose for me to really think about what I wanted to do with that information. And I thought, you know, it's sitting in this huge journal of over 600 pages. And I know that I could be sharing that experience and helping other people. So that's when I decided to write the book.
Okay, right. And obviously, as I said, I've read the book, and it's not something that I would normally pick up and read. And as I say, what I wouldn't say it was tough going as a page turner. It was just a bit painful. You brought out very well in the book your feelings of frustration, the personal abuse that you'd been through, and there was at times I wanted just to close the book and walk away, but then other times I wanted to know what happened with you and the therapist. There's an actual nice story that progresses through the book of your relationship with the therapist, but I also thought, and you probably agree with this, that this is the sort of book that every therapist in the world should order.
Yeah, I mean, I really do think it's helpful for a therapist. Not all therapists, when they train, specialize in this kind of childhood trauma. But even if they do, to be able to read such detail of that relationship, I think would be really helpful to enhance their practice. I would imagine that they would be reading it and their heads would be nodding. Sometimes they might raise an eyebrow in surprise. You know, the commitment from Hilary was incredible. I mean, you know, I'm still even now amazed at how dedicated and committed she was into helping me work through the impact of abuse, and how she was there for me and how she understood. And I'm hoping that will give some kind of acknowledgement and comfort to therapists. I think they're not well enough acknowledged for what they offer.
And another thing that surprised me, Tricia, is that, you know, even after your therapy sessions finished, there were times where you would text Hilary, you would email her, there was correspondence on that basis. And somebody like myself that's never been through the therapy side of things, it kind of, I suppose the right word is, shocked me a little bit. I had the impression from probably American movies on TV that you sat in front of a therapist, you paid them lots and lots of money, they sat back on the backside, listened, you know, good listeners, some bad listeners, the other, and then the door closed and you went about your normal life, and then you never saw them again until the next session, to which you paid a lot of money for as well. And that was my overall impression of a therapist. And again, that only stems from US movies, I would say. But, you know, your book really turned that on its head, if you like. You know, you were even funded, I think, at the beginning of the therapy sessions. I think eventually you had to pay a private side of things. And the sessions went on years and years, didn't they?
Yeah. So with Hilary, it was over a period of 6 years. That was interrupted because she was unwell a couple of times. But when she was unwell and unable to see me, I was looked after by Maggie and other therapists, so that I was never left without anyone to talk to, without anyone to take my pain to. But I think the main thing about it is that I didn't understand for a long time in therapy myself was the importance of being held in mind. You know, I never felt like I belonged or that I was taken care of. except for when I was very small. And what amazed me was how being held in mind and someone caring about you and thinking about you. And I would go back to another session, and Hilary would remember what we talked about before. And sometimes she would make a comment about something we talked about way before, but she remembered it. So, her work and commitment, the therapist, when they close the clinical room or the therapy room, they're not closing away from the people they see. In my case, it's evident, and it runs through the book, I think, that you can see how things were picked up in each session.
It does. And the other thing that I suppose surprised me a bit again, getting into my mind that image of the Hollywood actor sitting on the couch with the therapist and that sort of thing. You haven't dressed this book up. You said it several points, and I found it quite surprising that you got quite angry with your therapist at times, where and that really did surprise me, and it showed me your anxiety when you weren't able to get that therapy session, but B, your honesty came out in the book, and the book doesn't dress a therapy session up as all sweetness and roses. As soon as you go in, you put your mind to rest and everything's fine, and then you leave and you float on air for the next few days or whatever, and then another couple of weeks later you're back with the therapist and you're back to the niceness again. You had a lot of anger, if that's fair to say, when the therapist wasn't there. Is that right? Fair to say?
Yeah, I felt angry, rejected, abandoned, and it's interesting because it took me quite a long time to be able to share that with Hilary, because I felt so guilty and bad that I was so angry with someone who had given me so much and was so accepting of me and only ever showed me real care and concern. And what Hilary would say was, this is a place for me to be able to experience a relationship where abuse has no place. So I was allowed to have emotions, and it didn't matter whether they were joy, sadness, tears, anger, whatever it was. I was accepted for those emotions and those feelings, and it enabled me somewhere safe where I could work through them, things that I couldn't do as a child because I carried that for such a long time.
And that's what I was going to ask you. Do you think a lot of that anger was as a result of anger you were unable to express as a child, as a youth, as a young adult?
Yeah, I could never. If I glanced at my mum in any kind of way and showed her any negativity or disapproval or even pain, her reaction was more severe, and so I would freeze. Anger and other emotions, they became frozen in time because I couldn't name them. I was so disconnected from myself emotionally. It was the only way that I could survive what was happening to me at home and with this man. And so I just didn't feel emotion. So when I was in therapy, I would have a feeling, but I didn't know what it was. I couldn't name a feeling, which seems quite ridiculous for someone who was in a really, respected professional role with a lot of responsibility, yet in my personal inner world, I found it very difficult to name my emotions. And I would get physical sensations. So I'd get a sensation of how I would describe like a rock in my throat and a weight on my chest. And it would seem to stop me crying. It would seem to stop me connecting with those emotions. And I refer to it as an iceberg in the book. And I wanted it to go away and melt, but it took a long time and a lot of therapy for that to happen.
You were also very, very, dare I say, graphic in the book. I must admit, some of the pages I read shocked me. Didn't shock me because I know that sort of thing does go on. but I found it you were very honest, and I actually felt that emotion, and I felt as the reader that I was almost, drifting back in time myself, and I could actually sense how you felt as a young girl, and that came out in the pages of the book. Tell me, obviously, it's been out about just over a month now. Reviews and things, people commenting on it, friends, dare I say, your fellow professionals. What's been the reaction to the book?
Okay, well, so far the reviews have been really interesting. That they've been talked about courage, honesty, a must read. I mean, there've been very good reviews so far. And when friends have shared with me how they felt, they've said they just never knew I was carrying so much pain around with me. And colleagues that had worked with me for many, many years, 20 years, some of them, more, said they just had absolutely no idea that I had suffered in that way. And they also were very interested in how Hilary is.
Yeah.
And, she's got, without realizing it at the moment, she has a following.
Okay.
Because people want to know how she is. And
Hilary has read the book, I assume.
She has, and because I shared so much about our relationship, which is usually a very private, confidential, intimate space that doesn't get, the therapist certainly doesn't talk about it outside. When I was writing the book and I'd completed it and it was in manuscript form, I sent it to her so she could read it and decide for herself whether she was happy with everything that was in there. And she was very clear with me. She said, it's your story and it's for you to say as you see it. But I really wanted her to know what I was saying because so much of it is about her.
Yeah, that's interesting as well. That must have been a very nervous period for you when you sent her the manuscript and then you were sitting on tenterhooks waiting to see what her reaction was. If she'd come back and say, that book's terrible, you've been too personal, I don't want it published, what would you have done, Tricia?
I think I would have had a conversation with her about
what bits she didn't like.
Yeah, because she's a registered professional as a therapist. She was before she retired, and everybody has their own. All therapists have their own way of working, of course, but obviously they're all within the boundaries of the professional code of conduct and code of practice. And I just loved Hilary's character that came through in our relationship, and we laughed a lot as well as me crying and expressing my anger and distress. We also laughed, and it was lovely. And she was really pleased with me, not with me. She was really pleased with the manuscript. She was really saying to me how amazing she thought it was and how well I had done to be able to write it. So she was fully supportive of it.
Was there time during the initial writing stage of the book where you ever thought, I can't go ahead with this, I'm not going to do it, it's too personal, I don't want people to read about it?
I think until I actually submitted it, or just before I was submitting it to potential publishers, all of a sudden I kind of thought, oh, well, now this is going to be out there, and it isn't just my close friends who did proofreading for me, or Hilary or Maggie. This is going out beyond this safety of this small network of people that love and care about me and understand.
Do you know, as a writer myself, Trish, and as you know, I've got quite a few books published out there. I have to say that at that stage, every time that I put a book out there and it becomes available to the world and everybody can pick that book up, even people that might not like you, and there's always a period in an author's back of his mind, back of her mind, that do I really want this to go out onto Amazon so that everybody in the world can get there. But you know, I've never written anything anywhere near as personal as this. I haven't written a memoir, full stop. But I can only kind of imagine that there's that particular point, especially something that's been so personal, where you might just want to pull the plug and say, forget it.
Yeah, I think the main thing was some uncertainty about how graphic the content is. And I did think quite a lot about that. And I decided that as a small child, I lived through that. And it is what happened to me. And as a small child of 7 until I was around 13, I suffered those different types of abuse that's all in the book. And I had to bear it as a child. And what I was concerned about was obviously not wanting to cause pain to the reader, more pain than necessary, because it's a difficult read and it's never going to be an easy read for people. But I also didn't want to sanitize it, because I kind of felt, you know, this is what happens. And if this is what happened to me, and it happens, sanitizing information happens, it gets cleaned up. And, you know, that was one of my concerns, was that when I was submitting my book for publication, it was like, is the publisher going to say you can't put those swear words in it, or, you know, that's too graphic, it's too difficult for people to read? And that did worry me a little bit, but I just thought, well, I'll argue. If that's what I'm told, I'll argue.
Let me put your mind at rest. It's very graphic. 1 or 2 places is very graphic, but it's literally, you know, half a page out of about 300. So I certainly don't think you've made it too bad. Although 1 or 2 places, as I say, is quite graphic. But hey, that's what happened. That is what happened. I remember writing a book for an old prisoner of war many years ago now, 15 years ago, and there was a little bit sex in it. He was having sex in the POW camp, would you believe? And in that book, the old prisoner of war who was having sex in the prisoner of war camp, I interviewed him, and he gave us the exact description, which was quite graphic. And when I wrote the chapter and I read it back to him, and I said, Horace, the old guy was called Horace, that's a little bit graphic. Do you really want it to go in the book? And he said, that's what happened. That's what happened. So it's going in the book. And I must confess, we got a little bit of stick in some of the reviews. You know, that people said there was no need to go into that graphic detail. It wasn't too graphic, but I remember Horace saying that's what happened. And getting back to your book, listen, I take my hat off to you, Tricia, because you bared your soul to the reader, and that's what happened. That is what happened. So really, in the eyes of anybody publishing books, it needs to go in. It really needs to go in. And I'm glad that your publisher didn't argue with you and didn't think it was too graphic. And it's your words that's in the final copy of the book. As I say, I also think it's probably a must read for any survivors that have been through that sort of thing, who are contemplating therapy, or even in the middle of therapy. Again, I think it's a must read. I hope the book does incredibly well, and I hope you keep pushing it. And we're coming up towards the end of this meeting now. Tell your readers, your potential readers, is there book 2?
Yeah, I'm working on book 2, but I'm around the time of ending another long period of therapy, and I would like to spend some time reflecting on that before I write the second book. But I am working on it. And what I'd say is that, you know, for survivors, because we spoke about therapists, but for survivors, for people that have experienced any kind of trauma, that even though there are difficult moments in the book, that my aim is for it to be a story of hope and for survivors to take comfort from it and to understand how therapy can really work and help. And people talk about recovery and healing. I don't really think it's recovery and healing. I think it's being helped to work on the impact of abuse and to find a freedom, an emotional freedom. And that's what I found.
And I'm glad you've said that. I mean, I know sometimes survivors of abuse don't like the word closure, but dare I say, not complete closure, but once you wrote the end on the book, and then once you had your first few copies delivered, was there a little bit of you that could say, right now I can put a little bit of that horrible life behind me?
Well, I suppose that is a process that you go through, that it doesn't kind of get left behind as such, but it stops being a trauma.
Yes.
There are times when I might feel a bit fragile, but I'm able to be curious about that. And I'm able to think, what's that feeling? Where does it belong? Does it belong to the here and now? And often it belongs somewhere else. It belongs in the past, from a past hurt. And I'm able to work it through. And that's where the freedom comes. I don't feel bound and I don't feel silenced anymore. And when I had a copy of my book in my hand, I can't even begin to express how wonderful it felt and how satisfied I felt, because what I've done is told. Yeah. And you have to keep secrets when you're a kid and you're told you can't tell. But with my book, I've told, and I feel really good about that.
And you've told everything, and I'm so glad you said that. As I say, our time's drawn to a close. I really thank you for being a part of this interview. I really thank you for bearing your soul. I've said it once before, but you really have bared your soul in this book. And I wish you all the best, and I hope the reviews are great. And we'll look really forward to you and book 2 and book 3 and maybe 4. Okay.
Thank you.
Adios, Patricia.
Bye. Bye.